My business collapsed, and I lost my house overnight. I went to my son's place, hoping to stay for a few days. He said, "Dad, my wife isn't comfortable having you here." That night, I slept in my car. The next morning, a butler called me. He said his employer, a dying billionaire, had requested to see me before signing his will. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached." I never imagined that at 62 years old, I would be sitting in my car in a McDonald's parking lot, trying to figure out where I was going to sleep that night. The smell of French fries mixed with the musty odor of my old Honda, and I couldn't help but laugh bitterly at the irony. 3 months ago, I had an office on the 15th floor of a downtown building. Now I was counting the $7.38 in my wallet, wondering if that would be enough for a cup of coffee and maybe a burger. The collapse happened so fast I still can't fully process it. 35 years building Hartwell construction from nothing, and it all disappeared in a matter of weeks. The lawsuit from the Morrison project was the final nail in the coffin. When their foundation cracked due to soil issues we couldn't have predicted, they came after us with everything they had. My insurance company found a technicality to deny coverage, and suddenly I was facing a $2 million judgment I couldn't pay. I lost the business first, then the house. The bank didn't care about my decades of perfect payment history. Numbers on a spreadsheet don't have feelings, and mine were all in the red. I managed to salvage a few $1,000s from the sale of my tools and equipment, but that money went fast. Rent, food, gas, the basic necessities that I'd taken for granted for so long. That's how I ended up at Michael's door on a Tuesday afternoon, holding a single suitcase and what remained of my pride. My son lived in a beautiful colonial house in the suburbs, the kind of place I'd dreamed of buying when he was little. His wife Sarah had expensive taste, and it showed in every perfectly arranged detail of their home. "Dad?" Michael opened the door looking surprised, even though I'd called ahead. "I thought you were coming this weekend." "Plans changed," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Is now a bad time?" Before he could answer, Sarah appeared behind him. I'd never been her favorite person, but the look she gave me that day was different. It wasn't just dislike. It was something closer to disgust. "Walter," she said, my name sounding like a burden in her mouth. "Michael told me about your situation." I shifted the suitcase to my other hand. "I was hoping I could stay for a few days just until I get back on my feet. I won't be any trouble." Sarah crossed her arms, and I noticed Michael's posture change immediately. He'd always been a good kid, but somewhere along, the way he'd learned to read his wife's moods like weather patterns. "The thing is," Sarah continued, her voice taking on that particular tone women use when they're about to deliver bad news wrapped in false concern, "we have the Hendersons coming to stay this weekend, and you know how small our guest room is." I looked at Michael, waiting for him to say something, anything. We both knew the Hendersons lived 20 minutes away and had never stayed overnight in their lives. "Maybe there's a motel nearby," Michael said finally, not meeting my eyes. "Something temporary until you figure things out." Standing there on their doorstep, I felt something break inside me that had nothing to do with money or houses. This was my son, the boy I'd taught to ride a bike, helped with homework, cheered for at every baseball game, the man I'd put through college even when it meant taking on extra debt. "I see," I said quietly. Sarah's expression softened just enough to look sympathetic. "It's not that we don't want to help, Walter. It's just that this is such a difficult time for everyone. Michael's been so stressed about work, and I'm dealing with my mother's health issues. We barely have the emotional bandwidth to handle our own problems." Emotional bandwidth. I wondered when caring for family became something that required bandwidth, like an internet connection. "Of course," I said. "I understand." But I didn't understand. I didn't understand how the same woman who'd called me every time she needed help, moving furniture or wanted someone to watch their dog during vacation trips, could suddenly find me too much of a burden for a few nights on their couch. "There's a Hampton Inn about 10 miles from here," Michael said, finally looking at me directly. "It's not too expensive." $95 a night. I'd checked their website on my phone before coming over. 3 nights would wipe out most of what I had left. That sounds perfect, I lied. Sarah brightened immediately, the way people do when an uncomfortable situation resolves itself in their favor. And once you're settled somewhere permanent, we'd love to have you over for dinner. Maybe next month? Next month. When the inconvenience of my presence would be limited to a few hours and a home-cooked meal. I hugged Michael goodbye, and for a moment he held on a little longer than usual. I thought maybe he was going to change his mind, invite me in, tell Sarah that his father needed help, and that was that. Instead, he patted my back and said, "Take care of yourself, Dad." Walking back to my car, I heard their front door close with a soft click that sounded final. I sat in their driveway for a few minutes, watching their house. The lawn was perfectly manicured, the flower beds arranged with magazine precision. Through the living room window, I could see Sarah moving around, probably already forgetting I'd been there. The Hampton Inn was full. So was the Holiday Inn Express, and the 2 budget motels I tried after that. Apparently, there was some kind of conference in town, and every room was booked. By 8 o'clock, I was parked behind a 24-hour diner, trying to figure out how to sleep in a Honda Civic without looking like a homeless person. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent my entire career building homes for other people, and now I couldn't find a place to sleep. That's when my phone rang. The number on my phone wasn't one I recognized. After the day I'd had, part of me wanted to let it go to voicemail, but desperation makes you answer calls you might otherwise ignore. Walter Hartwell? The voice was formal, precise, with just a hint of an accent I couldn't place. Speaking. My name is Edmund Blackwood. I'm calling on behalf of my employer, Mr. Harrison Blackwell. He would very much like to meet with you tomorrow morning if you're available. I shifted in the driver's seat, trying to get comfortable against the Honda's worn upholstery. I'm sorry, who? Harrison Blackwell, Edmund repeated patiently. He's requested a meeting with you at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. It's quite urgent, I'm afraid. The name meant nothing to me. In 35 years of construction work, you meet a lot of people, but Harrison Blackwell wasn't ringing any bells. I think you might have the wrong Walter Hartwell, I said. I don't know anyone by that name. There was a pause, then the sound of papers rustling. Walter James Hartwell, born March 15, 1962, previously owner of Hartwell Construction? My stomach tightened. How do you know about my business? Mr. Blackwell has been quite specific about wanting to meet with you. He's not in the best of health, and time is rather precious. I looked around the empty parking lot. A few hours ago, I'd been turned away by my own son. Now a complete stranger was asking for a meeting like I was someone important. What does he want? I'm afraid I can't discuss the details over the phone, but I can tell you that Mr. Blackwell is prepared to compensate you for your time. Would $500 be sufficient for a 1-hour meeting? $500. More than I'd seen in weeks. I thought about my $7.38, about sleeping in my car, about the look on Sarah's face when she'd suggested a motel. Where? The Blackwell estate. I can send you the address. Shall we say 10 o'clock? I'll be there. After hanging up, I sat staring at my phone screen. The whole conversation felt surreal, like something that happened to other people. Rich strangers didn't just call up failed contractors and offer them money for meetings. But then again, a week ago, I wouldn't have believed I'd be sleeping in my car either. The address came through a few minutes later, 37 Elm Ridge Drive. I plugged it into my GPS and wasn't surprised to see it was in Millbrook Heights, where the houses started at $2 million and went up from there. I tried to sleep that night, but the Honda's seats weren't designed for someone my size. Every time I started to doze off, a car would pull into the diner's parking lot, headlights sweeping across my windshield. I spent most of the night staring at the ceiling, wondering what kind of man had enough money to pay $500 for an hour of a stranger's time. By morning, I was stiff, tired, and more than a little nervous. I cleaned up as best I could in the diner's bathroom, combing my gray hair with my fingers and splashing cold water on my face. The man in the mirror looked older than 62, worn down by months of stress and a night in a car. The Blackwell estate was everything I'd expected and more. The gates alone probably cost more than most people's cars, electronic and imposing, with B emblems worked into the iron scrollwork. A voice came through the intercom before I could even announce myself. "Mr. Hartwell, please proceed to the main house." The driveway curved through what looked like a professionally maintained park. Ancient oak trees lined the path, their branches forming a canopy overhead. The house, when it finally came into view, wasn't just large, it was magnificent. Colonial architecture with modern touches, probably 20,000 square feet, sitting on grounds that seemed to stretch forever. I parked my Honda between a Mercedes and a BMW, feeling like I'd brought a skateboard to a car show. Edmund Blackwood met me at the front door. He was exactly what I'd pictured. Tall, thin, impeccably dressed in a dark suit that probably cost more than my car. His gray hair was perfectly styled and his handshake was firm but brief. "Mr. Hartwell, thank you for coming. Mr. Blackwell is waiting for you in his study." He led me through rooms that belonged in a museum. Persian rugs covered hardwood floors that gleamed like mirrors. Oil paintings in heavy frames lined the walls, and every piece of furniture looked like it had been handcrafted by someone who'd never worried about money. The study was smaller than the other rooms, but somehow more impressive. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes, a massive mahogany desk, and windows that looked out over gardens that probably required a full-time staff. Harrison Blackwell sat behind the desk in a wheelchair, and I could see immediately that Edmund hadn't been exaggerating about his health. He was thin to the point of frailty, his skin pale and papery. But his eyes were sharp, alert, studying me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "Walter Hartwell," he said, his voice stronger than his appearance suggested. "Please sit down." I took the chair across from his desk, my work boots looking out of place on his expensive rug. "Thank you for coming," he continued. "I imagine you're wondering why I asked to see you." The thought had crossed my mind. He smiled, and for a moment something flickered in his expression. Recognition? Sadness? It was gone too quickly for me to be sure. "Tell me, Walter, do you remember a rainy night 8 years ago? October 23rd, to be exact. Route 12, just outside Millbrook?" My blood went cold. I hadn't thought about that night in years, had tried not to think about it, but suddenly I was right back there, rain pounding on my windshield, the curve coming up too fast, the headlights in the wrong lane. "How do you know about that?" Harrison Blackwell leaned forward in his wheelchair, his pale hands folded on the desk. "Because, Walter, I was in the other car." The words hit me like a physical blow. I gripped the arms of the chair, my heart pounding as that night came flooding back in vivid detail. The rain, the screech of brakes, the sickening sound of metal against metal. I'd tried so hard to forget, but some memories refused to stay buried. "You were—" I started, then stopped. My mouth had gone dry. Harrison nodded slowly. "The BMW that went through the guardrail. Yes, that was me." October 23rd, 8 years ago. I'd been driving home from a job site, exhausted after a 14-hour day trying to finish a kitchen renovation before the weekend. The rain had started around sunset and hadn't let up. Route 12 was always dangerous in weather like that with its sharp curves and steep drops, but I'd driven it 1,000 times. I was coming around the bend near Miller's Creek when I saw the headlights. They were in my lane, coming straight at me. The BMW was hydroplaning, completely out of control. I had maybe 2 seconds to react. "You swerved," Harrison said quietly, watching my face. "You could have stayed in your lane. The impact would have been head-on, but the other driver would have taken most of the damage. Instead, you swerved right into the guardrail." I remembered the decision, if you could even call it that. It was pure instinct. See danger, avoid it. I yanked the wheel hard, right, sending my truck into a skid that carried me straight into the metal barrier. The guardrail had held barely, but my truck was totaled. "You went through the rail," I said, the memory becoming clearer. "Down into the creek." 20 feet down, Harrison confirmed. "The car landed upside down in 3 feet of water. The impact knocked me unconscious." I closed my eyes, seeing it again. After my truck had come to a stop, I'd sat there for a moment, dazed, checking to see if anything was broken. That's when I'd heard the splash from below, seen the headlights pointing up through the rain. You climbed down, Harrison continued. The embankment was muddy, steep. You fell at least twice, I'm told. By the time you reached my car, it was filling with water. The details were coming back now, sharp and clear. The BMW had been crumpled like a tin can, driver's side down in the creek. Water was pouring in through the broken windows. I'd waded in, soaking myself to the waist in freezing October water. The door was jammed, I said softly. You broke the passenger window with a rock, cut your hands doing it. Then you pulled me out through the opening. I remembered that part vividly. Harrison had been unconscious, a dead weight, blood running from a gash on his forehead. Getting him through that window and up the embankment had been one of the hardest things I'd ever done physically. By the time I'd dragged him to the road, my back was screaming and my hands were torn up from the broken glass. The ambulance came, Harrison said. You rode with me to the hospital, stayed until my wife arrived. The doctors said if I'd been in that water for another few minutes. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. You saved my life, Walter. I shifted uncomfortably in the chair. Anyone would have done the same thing. Harrison's laugh was bitter. Would they? The police report said 3 other cars passed the scene before you arrived. 3 people who saw my headlights in the creek and kept driving. I hadn't known that. After that night, I'd tried to put the whole thing behind me. My insurance had covered the truck. I'd been unhurt except for some cuts and bruises, and I'd gone back to work the next Monday like nothing had happened. Why didn't you ever contact me? Harrison asked. After that night, I mean. You never called, never came by the hospital. I thought about how to explain it. It wasn't my business. You were alive, that's what mattered. I figured you had your own life to get back to. My own life, Harrison repeated, and there was something in his voice I couldn't identify. Do you know what I was doing that night, Walter? Why I was driving in weather like that? I shook my head. I was running away, from my wife, from my business, from everything. I'd just found out that my company was about to be investigated for fraud, environmental violations that could have sent me to prison for 20 years. I was scared, panicked, and I was driving to the airport to catch the first flight out of the country. The room fell silent except for the ticking of an antique clock on the mantelpiece. The accident changed everything, Harrison continued. While I was recovering, my lawyers found a way to clean up the mess. The investigation went away, the charges were dropped. By the time I was back on my feet, I had a second chance. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a thick manila folder. I built this empire because of that night, Walter. Because you gave me the chance to make things right. Blackwell Industries is worth $800 million today. I own real estate in 12 states, manufacturing facilities in 6 countries. All of it exists because you pulled me out of that creek. My head was spinning. I don't understand why you're telling me this. Harrison opened the folder and spread several documents across his desk. Because I'm dying, Walter. Pancreatic cancer. The doctors give me 2 months, maybe 3. And before I go, I need to settle my debts. He pushed one of the documents toward me. It was covered in legal language I didn't understand, but I could make out enough to see dollar amounts with a lot of zeros. This is my will, Harrison said. As of yesterday, you are the sole beneficiary of my estate. I stared at the paper, the words not making sense. What? Everything, Walter. The house, the business, the investments, all of it goes to you. That's... I struggled to find words. That's impossible. You have a family, children? Harrison's expression darkened. I have a son who hasn't spoken to me in 5 years. He's waiting for me to die so he can inherit enough money to support his gambling addiction and his third wife's shopping habits. I have a daughter who calls me twice a year, on my birthday and Christmas, and only to ask for money. Neither of them was in that creek 8 years ago. I pushed the document back toward him. I can't accept this. You don't have a choice. It's already done. The papers are filed. The lawyers have been paid. When I die, everything becomes yours. But why? I mean, I appreciate the gesture, but what happened that night, it was just human decency. It doesn't deserve this. Harrison leaned back in his wheelchair, studying me with those sharp eyes. "Do you know what you did after you pulled me out of that water, Walter? You gave me your jacket. You were soaking wet, shivering, your hands were bleeding, and you gave me your jacket to keep me warm. Then you sat with me in the rain until help arrived. You held my head to keep the water out of my mouth. I had forgotten about the jacket. You didn't know who I was. For all you knew, I was some drunk who'd nearly killed you, but you treated me like I mattered. Like my life had value. Do you have any idea how rare that is? Anyone would have—" "No," Harrison interrupted firmly. "Anyone wouldn't have. Most people would have called 911 and driven away. You stayed. You cared. And in 30 years of business dealing with thousands of people, you're the only person who ever showed me genuine kindness without wanting something in return." He pulled out another document, this one shorter and simpler. "This is a letter I wrote to you 3 years ago, after my first cancer diagnosis. I've rewritten it dozens of times, but I could never bring myself to send it. I kept thinking I'd have more time, that maybe I'd find a way to repay you that didn't feel so dramatic. Mr. Blackwell, I really can't—" "Harrison, and yes, you can, you will." His voice carried the authority of a man used to having his orders followed. "Because whether you like it or not, Walter, you're about to become a very wealthy man." I sat there staring at the documents, my mind reeling. This morning I'd woken up in my car with $7 to my name. Now this stranger was telling me I was going to inherit hundreds of millions of dollars. "There's something else," Harrison said, his voice softer now. "Something you need to know before you make any decisions about your family." He reached for a thick file folder I hadn't noticed before, one with my name written on the tab in neat handwriting. "I've been keeping track of you, Walter, not in a creepy way," he added quickly, seeing my expression. "But I wanted to know how you were doing, whether you were happy, successful, if you needed anything. I hired a private investigator to do periodic checks." My stomach clenched. "What kind of checks?" "The last report came in 2 weeks ago. I know about your business, about the lawsuit, about losing your house. I know you went to your son for help." Harrison opened the file and pulled out several photographs. They were surveillance shots taken with a long lens. Me standing on Michael's doorstep. Sarah's face in the window. Me walking back to my car. "I also know what they said to you." The blood drained from my face. "How could you possibly know that?" Harrison's smile was grim. "Money buys a lot of things, Walter, including very sophisticated listening devices. My investigator recorded the entire conversation." He reached into the folder again and pulled out a small digital recorder. "Would you like to hear it again?" "No," I said quickly, but Harrison was already pressing play. Sarah's voice filled the room, crystal clear and dripping with disdain. "It's not that we don't want to help, Walter. It's just that this is such a difficult time for everyone. Michael's been so stressed about work, and I'm dealing with my mother's health issues. We barely have the emotional bandwidth to handle our own problems." Then Michael's voice, weak and apologetic. "Maybe there's a motel nearby. Something temporary until you figure things out." Hearing it again was worse than living it the first time. The casual cruelty, the complete lack of empathy. These were people who'd called me when they needed help moving, when they wanted someone to watch their dog, when they needed a cosigner for their first mortgage. Harrison clicked off the recorder. "There's more, if you'd like to hear it. Conversations they had after you left. About how relieved they were that you didn't push harder, about how they'd been dreading this day for months, knowing eventually you'd come asking for help." I felt sick. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because you need to understand who these people really are before you make any decisions about your future, and because there's something else you should know." He pulled out another document, this one with Michael's name at the top. "Your son owes $43,000 in credit card debt. His wife has a shopping addiction that they've been hiding for years. Their mortgage is underwater and they're 3 months behind on payments." My head was spinning. "How do you know all this?" "Credit reports, bank records, public filings. It's amazing what money can buy in terms of information." Harrison's expression was grim. They're facing foreclosure, Walter. Within 6 months, they'll lose their house. But Michael said business was good. He got that promotion last year. The promotion came with a salary increase of $8,000 annually. Sarah's spending increased by $30,000 that same year. Harrison showed me a spreadsheet covered in numbers. She spends more on clothes in a month than most people make. I stared at the papers, trying to process what I was seeing. They're broke. Worse than broke, they're drowning, and they know it. Then why wouldn't they help me? If they understood what it was like to struggle. Harrison's laugh was bitter. Because admitting they had financial problems would have meant admitting Sarah was wrong, and Sarah is never wrong. It was easier to paint you as the irresponsible one, the father who should have planned better. The room felt like it was closing in on me. Everything I thought I knew about my son's life was a lie. The beautiful house, the expensive cars, the perfect suburban existence. It was all built on debt and denial. "There's more," Harrison said gently. "Conversations between your son and his wife about you, about your financial situation." He pressed play on the recorder again. "He's probably expecting us to bail him out," Sarah's voice said. "I mean, that's what parents are for, right? To clean up their children's messes." "Dad's not my child," Michael replied, but his voice was uncertain. "Might as well be. He's always been impractical. Who starts a construction business without planning for economic downturns? It's like he never learned how to be a real adult." Michael's voice again. "Maybe we could help him with a small loan." "With what money, Michael? We can barely cover our own expenses. Besides, he made his choices. He had 35 years to save for retirement, to build a safety net. It's not our fault he didn't." "But he's my father. And I'm your wife. Your primary responsibility is to me and our future children, not to some old man who couldn't manage his own life properly." The recording stopped. I sat there in silence, feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach. Future children. They'd been talking about having kids while simultaneously discussing how I was too much of a burden to help. "How long have you had this?" I asked. "The recording?" 2 days. My investigator sent it right after it happened." Harrison leaned forward in his wheelchair. "Walter, I want you to understand something. Your son didn't refuse to help you because he couldn't. He refused because she told him to, and he chose her opinion over his father's welfare. I thought about Michael as a little boy, how he used to follow me around job sites wearing a tiny hard hat I'd bought him, how he'd beamed with pride when I taught him to use a level, how he'd called my work building dreams. When had that admiration turned into resentment? "She's been working on him for years," Harrison continued, apparently reading my thoughts. "I have recordings going back 8 months. Little comments about how you're too dependent, too emotional. How successful men don't let family drama interfere with their goals." "He used to call me every Sunday," I said quietly. "When did that stop?" Harrison consulted the file. 14 months ago, right around the time Sarah started her campaign to help Michael establish healthy boundaries with toxic family members. Toxic. My own son thought I was toxic. "She's very good at it," Harrison said. "Manipulation, I mean. It's subtle, gradual. She never directly said he shouldn't help you. She just made him feel guilty for wanting to, made him think that caring about his father was a sign of weakness." I buried my face in my hands. 35 years of being a good father, of putting Michael's needs first, of working extra hours to pay for his college, his wedding, the down payment on his first apartment, all of it erased by a woman who saw me as competition for her husband's loyalty. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "I mean, I appreciate the money, the will, but why the investigation? Why dig into my family's dirty laundry?" Harrison was quiet for a long moment. "Because 8 years ago you showed me what real character looks like. You risked your life for a complete stranger, and you never asked for anything in return. I've spent these past years watching you, and I've never seen you deviate from that character, not once." He gestured toward the recorder. "But I also wanted to make sure you understood what you're dealing with, because what's about to happen next is going to test every relationship you have." "What do you mean?" I mean that when I die, which will be very soon, and when this will becomes public knowledge, your family is going to suddenly become very interested in reconciliation. They're going to come to you with tears in their eyes, talking about how sorry they are, how they made a mistake, how much they love you. I felt a chill run down my spine. Sarah will probably even suggest that her behavior was caused by stress, by worry about Michael's job security. She'll make herself the victim of circumstances beyond her control, and Michael will stand there nodding, believing every word. You think they'll try to get the money? I don't think it, Walter. I know it. Because I've seen this before. Money changes everything, and everyone around you will suddenly remember how much they care. Harrison pulled out one more document. This one sealed in an envelope with my name on it. This is a letter I want you to read after I'm gone. It contains some additional information about your family, some things I discovered that will help you make informed decisions about your future. What kind of things? The kind that will make it very clear who you can trust and who you can't. Harrison's expression was sad. I'm sorry, Walter. I know this isn't what you wanted to hear, but you deserve to know the truth before you have to make any choices. I took the envelope, noting how heavy it felt in my hands. How long do I have? I asked. Before days, maybe a week. The doctors aren't sure. Harrison smiled, and for the first time since I'd arrived, it looked genuine. But I'm not afraid. I've made my peace with everything, settled my debts, including the one I owed you. You don't owe me anything. I owe you everything. His voice was firm. And now you'll have the resources to build whatever kind of life you want, without having to depend on people who see you as a burden. As I left the Blackwell estate that afternoon, I drove past my son's house. Michael's car was in the driveway, and I could see him through the living room window, probably getting ready for dinner. A normal evening in what looked like a normal life. But now I knew the truth about what was behind that perfect facade. The debt, the lies, the casual cruelty, and soon I'd have to decide what to do with that knowledge. The envelope from Harrison sat heavy in my jacket pocket, full of secrets I wasn't sure I wanted to know. But as I drove toward the motel I could now afford, I realized that for the first time in months I wasn't afraid of tomorrow. I was angry, and that felt surprisingly good. Harrison Blackwell died on a Tuesday morning exactly 5 days after our meeting. I got the call from Edmund while I was having breakfast at the diner where I'd been eating most of my meals. The funeral was private, he said, just immediate family. I wasn't invited, which was fine by me. I'd said my goodbyes already. The will reading was scheduled for the following Friday. Edmund had insisted I attend, even though I already knew what it contained. He said there were additional documents Harrison wanted distributed, things that couldn't be handled through normal legal channels. I spent those intervening days in a strange kind of limbo. I'd upgraded from sleeping in my car to a decent motel room, but I didn't dare make any major plans. Part of me still couldn't believe this was real. Maybe Harrison had changed his mind at the last minute. Maybe his family would contest the will. Maybe I'd wake up tomorrow and find out it had all been some elaborate mistake. But Friday morning came, and Edmund called to confirm the appointment. The law offices of Pemberton, Hayes & Associates occupied 3 floors of a downtown building that screamed old money, the kind of place where the furniture was older than most people and the secretaries spoke in hushed, reverent tones. I arrived 15 minutes early, wearing the only decent suit I owned. It was 5 years old and didn't fit quite right anymore, but it was clean and pressed. The receptionist directed me to a conference room on the 20th floor, where floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the city that probably cost more per square foot than most people's entire apartments. I wasn't alone. Harrison's son, Richard, sat at one end of the massive mahogany table, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe 35, with his father's sharp eyes but none of his presence. His suit probably cost more than my car, and his watch caught the light in a way that suggested serious money. His sister, Amanda, sat across from him, checking her phone with the bored expression of someone who considered this whole proceeding a waste of her time. She was beautiful in the way that money makes possible: perfect hair, perfect makeup, clothes that fit like they'd been made specifically for her body. Neither of them acknowledged my presence when I walked in. The lawyer, James Pemberton, was exactly what central casting would have ordered for this role. Gray-haired, distinguished, expensive suit, and the kind of voice that suggested generations of prestigious education. He spread several folders across the table and cleared his throat. "We're here today for the reading of the last will and testament of Harrison Maxwell Blackwell," he began, his tone formal and impersonal. "As you all know, Mr. Blackwell made some significant changes to his estate planning in the weeks before his death." Richard leaned forward. "How significant?" Pemberton consulted his notes. "The previous will, dated 3 years ago, left the bulk of the estate divided equally between his 2 children. The new will, executed 2 weeks ago, supersedes that document entirely." Amanda looked up from her phone for the first time. "What do you mean, supersedes?" "I mean, Miss Blackwell, that the new will contains very different provisions." Pemberton opened the first folder and began reading in that measured, legal tone that somehow managed to drain all emotion from even the most shocking statements. "To my son, Richard, who has spent the last 5 years waiting for me to die so he can inherit enough money to support his gambling debts and his wife's spending habits, I leave the sum of $100,000. This should be sufficient to pay for rehabilitation programs should he choose to address his addictions." Richard's face went white. "What the hell is this?" Pemberton continued reading without pause. "To my daughter, Amanda, who has called me exactly 16 times in the past 5 years, each time to request money for various personal expenditures, I leave the sum of $100,000. Perhaps this will purchase enough designer handbags to fill the emptiness that material possessions clearly haven't filled so far." Amanda shot to her feet. "This is insane. He can't do this." "I assure you, Miss Blackwell, your father was of sound mind when he executed this document. There are medical evaluations to confirm his mental competency." "Then who gets everything else?" Richard demanded. Pemberton turned to me. "The remainder of Mr. Harrison Blackwell's estate, valued at approximately $786 million, including all business interests, real property, investments, and personal effects, is left to Walter James Hartwell." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the air conditioning humming through the vents. Richard and Amanda both stared at me like I'd just materialized out of thin air. "Who the hell is Walter Hartwell?" Amanda finally asked. Pemberton consulted his notes again. "According to the documentation provided by your father, Mr. Hartwell saved his life 8 years ago in an automobile accident. The will specifically states that Mr. Hartwell is the only person who ever showed me genuine kindness without expecting anything in return." Richard's chair scraped against the floor as he pushed back from the table. "This is insane. Our father leaves nearly $800 million to some random stranger because of a car accident." "Not random," I said quietly. It was the first time I'd spoken since entering the room. "I pulled your father out of a creek after his car went through a guardrail. He would have drowned if I hadn't been there." Amanda rounded on me. "So what? You did what any decent person would do, and now you think you deserve our inheritance?" "I didn't ask for this," I said. "I didn't even know who your father was until a week ago." "Bullshit," Richard snapped. "Nobody gives away that kind of money to a stranger. What's your angle? What did you do to manipulate him?" Before I could answer, Pemberton cleared his throat again. "There are additional documents your father asked me to distribute." He handed me a sealed envelope with my name on it, then gave similar envelopes to Richard and Amanda. He requested that these be opened and read aloud in everyone's presence. My envelope contained a single sheet of paper with Harrison's letterhead. The handwriting was shaky but legible. "Walter," I read aloud, "if you're reading this, then Richard and Amanda have just learned that their years of indifference and greed have finally caught up with them. They're probably calling you a manipulator, suggesting you somehow tricked a dying old man into changing his will. Don't let them. You earned this inheritance 8 years ago, when you risked your life for a stranger. But you've proven you deserve it every day since by living with integrity and kindness, qualities my children never learned." I looked up to see both siblings, staring at me with undisguised hostility. Richard tore open his envelope and began reading in a voice tight with anger. To Richard, your gambling debts currently total $623,000. You've borrowed against your trust fund, taken cash advances on 17 different credit cards, and forged my signature on 3 separate occasions to access funds from accounts you had no right to touch. The private investigator's report is attached for your reference. His face was scarlet now. He was having us investigated? Amanda's hands were shaking as she opened her own letter. To Amanda, in the past 3 years, you've spent over $400,000 on clothes, jewelry, and cosmetic procedures while claiming to be a struggling artist. You've never sold a single painting, never held a job for more than 2 months, and you've been living off money you've been stealing from the household account for years. The documentation is attached. She crumpled the letter in her fist. This is harassment. This is character assassination. This is truth, Pemberton said calmly. Your father was very thorough in his documentation. Richard turned to me, his face twisted with rage. You did this. You poisoned him against us. I met your father exactly once before he died, I said, last week. Then how did he know about our... Richard stopped himself, apparently realizing that finishing that sentence would be an admission. Your father hired private investigators, Pemberton explained. He wanted to understand who he was leaving his money to. That included investigating his own children. Amanda was crying now, but they were angry tears, not sad ones. He was our father. How could he humiliate us like this? Maybe, I said quietly. He was hoping you'd prove him wrong. The meeting continued for another hour, covering the technical details of the inheritance, the transfer of assets, the legal procedures that would need to be followed. But the real drama was over. Richard and Amanda left without saying goodbye, their faces set in identical expressions of fury and disbelief. As I walked to my car afterward, my phone rang. Michael's name appeared on the screen. Dad, I just heard, is it true? About Harrison Blackwell? Word traveled fast in a city this size. I wondered who had called him, how the news had already spread. It's true. Jesus, Dad. $700 million? I can't even... that's incredible. There was something in his voice I'd never heard before. Not excitement exactly, more like calculation. Yeah, I said. It's incredible. Listen, Sarah and I were talking and we feel terrible about the other day. We were stressed, overwhelmed, and we said some things we didn't mean. We'd love to have you over for dinner tomorrow night. To celebrate and to apologize. I sat in my car outside the law office, looking up at the building where I'd just inherited more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. 24 hours ago, these same people had told me they didn't have the emotional bandwidth to help their homeless father. Now they wanted to celebrate. That's very generous, I said. Let me think about it. Of course, take your time. We'll be here whenever you're ready. After hanging up, I drove to the cemetery where my wife was buried. Margaret had been gone for 12 years now, cancer taking her just 2 years before, the accident that had changed everything. I sat by her headstone and told her about Harrison, about the inheritance, about our son's sudden change of heart. What should I do, Maggie? I asked the granite marker. You always knew what was right. The wind rustled through the oak trees overhead, but it didn't sound like an answer, it just sounded like wind. That night, I opened the sealed envelope Harrison had given me during our meeting, the one with additional information about my family. Inside were photographs, bank records, and a transcript of a conversation between Michael and Sarah from just 3 days ago. If he really does inherit all that money, Sarah's voice said on the recording, we need to make sure we're back in his good graces. I've been thinking about how to handle this. Handle what? The reconciliation. We can't just pretend nothing happened. We need a story that explains our behavior without making us look bad. What kind of story? We were protecting him. We knew he was proud and we didn't want him to feel like a charity case. So we encouraged him to be independent, to solve his own problems. It was tough love. Michael's laugh was hollow, You think he'll buy that? He'll want to buy it. Nobody wants to believe their family doesn't care about them. Give people a face-saving explanation, and they'll usually take it. I turned off the recording and sat in the darkness of my motel room, feeling something cold and hard settle in my chest. Tomorrow I'd go to dinner at my son's house, but not for the reasons they expected. I arrived at Michael's house at exactly 7 o'clock, carrying a bottle of wine I'd bought for the occasion. Not an expensive one. I was curious to see if they'd notice. Sarah answered the door wearing a dress I'd never seen before, something that probably cost more than I used to make in a week. "Walter." She embraced me like we were old friends, holding on just a little too long. "I'm so happy you could come. We have so much to talk about." The house looked different somehow. Cleaner, more organized, like they'd spent the day preparing for an important guest. The dining room table was set with their good china, candles flickering in crystal holders. It was the kind of effort they'd never made for regular family dinners when I was just their broke father. Michael appeared from the kitchen, grinning broadly. "Dad, come in, come in. Can I get you a drink? We've got that scotch you like." I'd never expressed a preference for any particular scotch, but I didn't correct him. "Just water for now," I said. Sarah took my arm, guiding me toward the living room. "We thought we'd sit and talk before dinner. There's so much catching up to do." We settled into their expensive furniture, and for a few moments nobody spoke. They kept glancing at each other, some kind of silent communication I wasn't supposed to notice. "So," Michael finally said, his voice carefully casual, "this inheritance thing, that's really something." "It is." $700 million, Sarah said, shaking her head in apparent amazement. "I can't even imagine having that kind of money. What are you going to do with it all?" "I haven't decided yet." Another glance between them. Sarah leaned forward, her expression earnest. "Walter, before we go any further, Michael and I need to apologize for the other day. We handled that situation terribly." "We were stressed," Michael added quickly. "Sarah's mother has been having health problems and my job's been crazy. We weren't thinking clearly." Sarah nodded vigorously. "The truth is, we were trying to protect you. We knew how proud you are, how independent. We thought if we offered to help right away, you'd feel like a charity case." "It was tough love," Michael said, using exactly the phrase from the recording. "We wanted you to know we believed in your ability to bounce back." I took a sip of my water and studied their faces. They looked so sincere, so concerned. If I hadn't heard the recording, I might have believed them. "That's very thoughtful," I said. "We've always believed in you, Dad. You raised me to be strong, independent. We just wanted to honor that." Sarah reached over and squeezed my hand. "Family is the most important thing in the world. We never want you to doubt that we love you." "Of course," I said. "Family is everything." They both relaxed visibly. Sarah smiled, the kind of radiant expression she usually reserved for when she got her way about something. "So tell us about this Harrison Blackwell," she said. "What was he like?" I described my meeting with Harrison, leaving out the parts about the surveillance and the recordings. I told them about the accident, about pulling him from the creek, about how grateful he'd been. "You saved his life," Michael said, pride evident in his voice. "Of course he wanted to reward you." "It's like something out of a movie," Sarah added, "the hero getting his just reward." Dinner was elaborate, prime rib, expensive wine, all of my supposed favorite foods. They asked questions about my plans, offered suggestions about investments and financial advisors. Sarah mentioned a charity she supported, something about children's literacy, and how wonderful it would be if I wanted to get involved. "Philanthropy is so important when you have means," she said. "It's a way of giving back, of making a difference." "We could help you set something up," Michael offered. "Sarah has connections in the nonprofit world." After dinner, we moved to the living room for coffee. That's when Sarah brought out the photo album. "I was going through some old pictures," she said, settling beside me on the couch. "Look at this one. It was from Michael's wedding day, all of us smiling at the camera. We look so happy," she said softly. "Family is everything, isn't it?" She turned the pages, showing me pictures from holidays, birthdays, graduations, all the moments when we'd been together, when everything had seemed normal. "I know we haven't been as close as we should be," Michael said. "Life gets busy, people get caught up in their own problems. But at the end of the day, we're family. That's what matters." Sarah closed the album and looked at me with tears in her eyes. "I hope you can forgive us, Walter, for not being there when you needed us. We want to do better." "We want to be a real family again," Michael added. I set down my coffee cup and smiled at them. "I appreciate that, I really do." "So we're okay?" Sarah asked hopefully. "Oh, we're fine," I said. "In fact, I have something for you." I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out 2 envelopes, handing one to each of them. "What's this?" Michael asked. "Open them." Sarah tore hers open first. Inside was a cashier's check for $25,000. Michael's contained the same amount. "Dad, what's this for?" Michael asked, staring at the check. "It's a gift," I said. "From someone who understands what it's like to be struggling financially." They both looked confused. "Struggling?" Sarah said. "We're not struggling." I pulled out a folder I'd been carrying and set it on the coffee table. "Actually, you are. $43,000 in credit card debt. 3 months behind on your mortgage. Sarah's spending has increased by $30,000 a year while your income has remained flat." The color drained from both their faces. "How do you know that?" Michael whispered. "The same way I know about the conversation you had 3 days ago, planning how to handle my reconciliation. The same way I know you told your wife I was too much of a burden to help because you barely had the emotional bandwidth for your own problems." Sarah's mouth opened and closed like a fish. "Walter, I can explain." "You don't need to explain. I understand perfectly. You thought I was a failure, a burden, someone whose problems were too inconvenient to deal with. You were probably hoping I'd just disappear so you wouldn't have to feel guilty anymore." Michael leaned forward, desperation creeping into his voice. "Dad, that's not fair. We love you." "No," I said quietly. "You love what I can give you. There's a difference." I stood up, buttoning my jacket. "The checks are yours to keep. Consider it payment for a valuable lesson." "What lesson?" Sarah asked, her voice small. "That your father isn't stupid, and that sometimes karma takes a while, but it always collects." Michael stood as well, panic in his eyes. "Dad, wait, don't leave like this. We can work this out." "There's nothing to work out, son. You made your choice when I needed help. I'm just making mine now." "But we're family," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. "Family forgives each other." I paused at the front door. "You're right, family does forgive. But forgiveness doesn't mean pretending things didn't happen, and it doesn't mean I have to keep putting myself in a position to be hurt." "What are you saying?" Michael asked. "I'm saying goodbye." 6 months later, I was sitting on the porch of my new house, watching the sunset over the lake. It wasn't a mansion like Harrison's place, but it was mine. Paid for with cash, no mortgage, no debt, no one who could take it away from me. The inheritance had been finalized without contest. Richard and Amanda Blackwell had apparently decided that fighting over $100,000 wasn't worth the legal fees. I'd kept Harrison's businesses running, hiring good people to manage what I didn't understand myself. I'd heard through mutual acquaintances that Michael and Sarah had used the $25,000 to catch up on their mortgage payments. They'd also heard somehow about my new address. Michael had called twice, leaving voicemails I hadn't returned. Sarah had sent a card at Christmas. I hadn't blocked their numbers or refused their contact entirely. I just didn't engage. When someone shows you who they really are, believe them the first time. Maya Angelou had said that, and she'd been right. The truth was, I wasn't angry anymore. Anger required emotional investment, and I'd stopped investing in people who saw me as a means to an end rather than someone worth loving. I had made new friends in my new town, people who knew me as the guy who'd inherited some money from a grateful stranger, not as someone's disappointing father or inconvenient relative. They invited me to barbecues and poker games and didn't expect anything from me except my company. I'd also started volunteering at a local shelter for homeless veterans, helping guys who reminded me of myself not too long ago, Men who'd lost everything through circumstances beyond their control, who just needed someone to see them as human beings deserving of dignity and respect. It turned out that being genuinely wealthy wasn't about the money itself. It was about the freedom to choose who you spent your time with, who you helped, who you loved. It was about never having to compromise your values or accept poor treatment because you needed something from someone. As the sun disappeared behind the mountains, I thought about Harrison Blackwell and the night that had changed both our lives. He'd been running away from his problems when I pulled him from that creek. But maybe, in a way, he'd been running toward this moment, toward the chance to give someone else the freedom he'd never known how to find himself. Margaret's picture sat on the table beside my chair, and I raised my glass of wine in her direction. "We did okay, Maggie," I said to the photograph. "We raised a son who became exactly what his mother wanted him to be. That's not our fault." The evening air was soft and warm, filled with the sound of crickets and the gentle lapping of water against the shore. Somewhere in the distance, a family was having a barbecue, their laughter carrying across the lake. It was the sound of people who actually enjoyed each other's company, who chose to be together instead of feeling obligated. The sound of real family, the kind you create rather than the kind you're born into. I closed my eyes and listened, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt completely at peace.